No academic who cares about their job is going to ignore, certainly in the UK, is going to ignore that hefty policy for the ref on open access. So the shape of this presentation, just very briefly, is I'm going to give you a little bit of context, but most of you will know that, so I shan't spend much time on it. I'm going to talk about the benefits of open access for authors and then for the policy makers, the funders and the institutional managers, and then finish with just one slide about what's being talked about at the moment in terms of what's going to happen and what we're concerned about right now. So the contextual stuff then first. Well, here we go. Just a quick definition again of open access. I'm sorry for those of you who already know this. It's the immediate and free to use, free of restrictions on use of the peer-reviewed literature. Peer-reviewed literature. It's not vanity publishing. And it's not, let's all just put everything up on the web and forget all about the quality control and anything else. But it is moving scholarly communication into the age of the web. Now, I've been putting this point in my slide for many years, and the age of the web is, of course, quite sizable now. We're talking about 20 years of web for all of us. I've just put this in for interest for you. This is the cover page of Tim Berners-Lee's initial paper sketching out his ideas for the World Wide Web. He called it Information Management, a Proposal. And this was his preview, which he gave to his supervisor. He was working at CERN at the time. You can see the diagrams there. I'm sure they make sense to some of you. Gave it to his supervisor, and his supervisor wrote something on the top there, which you can see, but probably not clearly, but now you should be able to see it, which was probably one of the, has to be the understatement of human history, doesn't it? Vague but exciting. Indeed, it was vague but exciting, and our lives changed because of it and continue to do so. And yet, in fact, our lives have changed in almost every single aspect, except the way scholars communicate with one another. And I look a bit sad, I am sad about that, because we should have been doing this open access thing and doing things better 15 years ago, and then we would be a lot better off as a society, I believe. Anyway, how do you do it? You can publish in open access journals, you can make your work available through open access repositories if you cannot find an open access journal that you want to publish in. And for those of you in the humanities and some parts of social sciences where your primary output format is a book, you can now publish your books or book chapters in an open access form. There's plenty of new initiatives going on in that area, which we could talk about if you want to in the discussion or debate session later. So here's a repository, just to reassure those of you who live here and work here, you have got one. It's called Bureau. If you've not put anything in it, please do this afternoon when you go away. Where are we with open access? Well, just very quickly, this graph shows in different disciplines the levels of open access that there were when we measured this last summer. We're just doing that again. Stephen Harnad's group is doing it, and the new results will be published over the next few months. The colours here signify different things. The green areas are the repository-based open access. The gold, the bright yellow is what we call gold open access, which is papers published in open access journals. And the little bit at the top, the orange bits, little in most cases, is what we call delayed gold open access, which is where journals, particularly in the life sciences, make their contents freely available on their websites after a period of time. It's usually about 12 months when they're sure that they've sold the copies that they want to, their subscription income won't be threatened, and so they're happy to make it available. Put in another way, on a time base, on a time series, this is a graph showing, and we don't need to go into details, the levels of open access material available in different disciplines over years. And what you can take away from this graph is that there is not much growth over the last 10 years or so, which is a bit sad. Why not? And that is a question that I keep asking. Why are authors not making their work open access? Well, let's see if I can persuade those of you here who are authors why you should be doing this. It doesn't take long, and it doesn't have to cost anything. But there are tremendous benefits, so here they are. First of all, you get greater visibility for your work. From that visibility comes greater usage of your work. From the usage comes greater impact. As Ian said, you know, buzzword of the moment for you people. You can profile and market yourselves and your work much more effectively, and kind of guide your own career in ways that were not available to those of us who are above a certain age, who were academics a long time ago. So let's look at the visibility thing first. Here's a nice quote from a philosopher who puts his work, and has been doing so incidentally for 20 years, so he's an early adopter here. He puts his work in a central repository on philosophy called the PhilSci Archive, and what his testimony is that it's given worldwide visibility to his work, and that has had some knock-on effects, beneficial ones in terms of his career. Martin Skidmore, who is at Queensland University of Technology and who we will come upon again during this talk, gives a slightly different angle. He is based in Australia. He's an urban design man, so he's kind of town planning and architecture. Expects to do, or hopes to do, quite a lot of collaboration with the countries on the Pacific Rim. And what he's saying here is that putting his work in the institutional repository at QUT is giving his work a lot more visibility, and he's getting interest from places like, he's picked out Malaysia, countries which otherwise would not be subscribing in large numbers to the journals that he publishes in. So he's reaching a new audience. That's what he's saying here in this testimony. With respect to the usage that comes from that visibility, here is the best filled and most successful repository in the world. It's at the University of Liège in Belgium, and this graph shows the growth of the content in that repository. You can ignore the red line because that is records only, with no full text papers to go with them. There's a reason for those being in there, but we don't need to discuss that today. The blue line at the bottom is the one to focus on. This is the growth of open access papers in that repository. And as you can see, it's been growing nice and steadily. It started to grow here, right at the bottom here. It was flat until then. That's when the mandatory policy, with a good tweak to it, was introduced. The tweak is that the rector said, this is a mandate, but you're academics and you don't ever obey what I say. That's up to you. But if you want promotion, if you want tenure, or if your work, want your work to be assessed by any committee in this university, we will look in the repository for your papers. We're not going to look in journals, and we don't want you to send lists of journals and links to your papers in journals. We'll look there. So that's why the number of papers deposited started to rise. And you'll notice that in the first year or so after that, there's a little shoulder there. That's May, which is 1 month before the promotion and tenure committees sit in that university. So in the first year, people were very keen suddenly to get their work in there. After that, it's been a steady rise. Everybody's putting their work in. 85% of the university's outputs are now being collected in full text immediately after publication. Just to reassure those, again, in the humanities, that it is entirely possible to have open access in the humanities. Note the yellow part of this pie chart, which just shows that that university is also collecting its humanities outputs, books or parts of books there, collecting in the repository. The usage of the material in that repository is shown in this graph here. This is the number of downloads. Look at the numbers. up to 100 and, well, let's say 120,000 or let's say 100,000 as the average per month of the material in that repository. So it's getting a lot of usage, and I want to emphasize that this is usage not from the journals. These are people who do not have access to the journals because their libraries can't afford to pay. It's a new audience for these academics here in this university, secured simply through open access. So this is new attention, better visibility, new usage, and translating into greater impact. The individual article usage, this graph just shows the kinds of numbers that some articles can achieve in terms of downloads. So that, as you can see, goes up into the thousands in a month. This is per month. And just to take another example, so not Liège, the most successful repository, but a standard average-sized research-based university, this is Salford University, which also has a mandatory policy. Its repository is called User, has about 9,000 records in it, and that's getting an average of about 4,000 downloads a month for those records. Very pleased these people are with that kind of usage, because it is new usage and you can see it. If you publish in a subscription-based journal and do nothing about open access, you don't know what your usage is. You don't know how many pairs of eyes are looking at, downloading and looking at that paper because it's on the publisher's website. And so this is open access giving you a better idea of what's being done with your work. In terms of the individual authors, this is back at QUT now, and you can see I've just highlighted on the right there, this is the all-time numbers, and you can see that our man Martin Skidmore is at the top there with over 200,000 downloads of his work. He hasn't published that many papers. So that's all time, and in the last month, as an example, he's had nearly 5,000 downloads of the papers that he's put in that repository, and as you can imagine, he's very pleased with that. That kind of usage, the reading of papers, translates in many cases into citation impact. This is the kind of impact that academics themselves care most about, citations, because you're still measured largely on that. You may be measured on that through a very bizarre metric called the journal impact factor, but basically the more citations you get, the happier you are. And this graph shows, it shows something slightly complicated, so let me just explain. It shows the increase in citations to papers that are made open access, so the increase in citations compared to papers that are not made open access. And to compare those two things, the people who did this study took papers in, they looked on the web for a paper that was fully available from the moment of publication, and then they looked for a paper in the same issue of the same journal, so as like as you can get, that was not freely available on the web. It was just in the journal. Okay, so you're comparing open access with closed access as like as possible. And that is the increase in citations, or the percentage increase in different disciplines. Now, the citation impact advantage does differ from discipline to discipline. We think that's because of the different citation behaviours in different disciplines. But in every discipline studied, it shows up. Okay, it may show up to a different extent, but it shows up. So that's a citation impact advantage. Now we'll have a look at what that means for individual authors, because it's all very well me standing here saying that's what happens, but it's much more interesting to look at an individual author and see his story. So we're going back to QUT's repository, because QUT has had a repository for 10 years now with a mandate on it. So it gathers a lot of material. At the top of the top 50 authors in terms of downloads, we have somebody called Ray Frost, who is an inorganic chemist. And next we have our friend Martin Skidmore again. So we look at Ray Frost first. If you go to the Web of Science, you can for yourselves, and you probably do this, I'm sure you do, look at your publication record in terms of numbers of papers and then look at the citations to those papers as they accumulate. And you get a graph like this, or two graphs side by side like this. This is for Ray Frost, the inorganic chemist. There's his numbers of papers. Admittedly, it's high because he's an inorganic chemist, and if there are any inorganic chemists here, you'll hopefully verify the fact that you can publish a lot of small papers because you're saying certain individual quick things about a molecule that you're synthesizing or looking at or something, breaking down or something. So this is his publication record. It was low here, but as you can see, it got a bit bigger there, and then it grew a little bit there. The number of papers has grown, but not madly. But look at what's happened to the citations. Now, at this point here, he started putting his papers in the repository as they were published. So until then, the number of citations was so-so. And as soon as he started making those freely available to the world, we got a kind of logarithmic curve in the citation impact to his work. If that graph doesn't convince you, let's have a look at our friend Martin Skidmore, whose publication record is much more patchy. I don't know what he was doing in these 3 years here, but not much. However, and in fact, the number of papers goes down, and yet you still see from 2004 that same kind of citation pattern. These people and many others at QUT, because I've analysed that repository for the management, show this, that from the moment they started making their work open access, their general citation impact has started to increase. Now, you know, there may be some other reasons for that too, like better electronic availability and so forth, but the correlation is very persuasive. If you take a whole discipline and look at the citations of open access papers compared to non-open access papers in those same journals, you see this kind of pattern. There is always a gap, whatever discipline you look at, and there's three of them. So social sciences, clinical medicine and engineering, three very different things. There's always a gap, and that gap gets bigger. So the earlier you make your work open access, and you must make your work open access, the earlier you do it, the greater the benefit to you in terms of citation impact. With respect to the profiling and marketing point, I don't want to spend too long on this, but people here at Bournemouth have an ePrints-based repository. That's just the software that it uses. And that software is much the same as other kinds of software, so wherever you come from, you've probably got this sort of output from your repository. It can give you information on a day-to-day basis, or a week-to-week, or month-to-month, or year-to-year, whatever you choose to ask it, about how your work is being downloaded. Can't tell you about citations, although that data can be imported from citation databases to run alongside the repository. But it can tell you about downloads, and downloads tend to predict later citations. So this is very useful information for you researchers in the audience. So you can ask it to give you a graph of, say, the last month or whatever, and it will give you a picture like this. This is from one of my papers, so it doesn't have a huge numbers of downloads. However, it's quite interesting that you get I got a spike there right at the beginning, and I did nothing to publicize that paper, so I don't know who those people were. And then there was a nice long period of what I call reasonable usage. It's not in the thousands like these others, but it's still nice to know. You can also ask the repository for more information, and it will give you something like this. Now, again, I don't want to talk in detail about most of this, but I do want to show you this bottom right-hand corner, which is where you can see the academic domains from which the downloads are coming. Now, that's a lovely thing to know. because you don't know that if you just publish in a subscription-based journal, you not only don't know how many people are downloading your work, but you certainly don't know where they're coming from, whereas your repository can tell you that. And we have heard some very nice stories about people, you know, looking and saying, wow, I've got some downloads from Stanford, who could that be? And trying to follow those up and ending up with very nice research collaborations with people they didn't know were interested in their work. Melissa Terras is a humanist at University College London. I'm not going to say too much about this because I feel that some later speakers may have something to say, but she is giving testimonies on her blog about how having her work in the UCL repository is helping her to understand the usage and the impact of her work. So she's tracking, using the repository's graphing function, the number of downloads. She's tweeting and pushing her work out, and she can see spikes of usage, and then it goes quiet for the weekend in this particular case. And then she retweets it on Monday and it picks up again and somebody else retweets it. So this is the kind of thing you could never understand about the usage of your work before an open access repository came along as a tool to enable you to do that. So that's for researchers. Now I move to institutions because I think we have some research office managers here or research office people from institutions. Martin Hall, the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Salford, has put a mandatory policy on his university and is very much an open access advocate. His argument goes like this, that open access is about many things, but it's not just about political or economic or professional things. It's about what the university's role is in society and what it should be doing to engage people outside that university space. And when we think about the benefits of open access for funders and institutions, we get the usual things that we looked at with respect to the authors, and of course they're aggregated for institutions. They benefit from the aggregate impact of their researchers. But we also have three new things here. Outreach to the public to demonstrate social return, which I believe universities in the UK at least are under an obligation to do something about now. There are economic benefits to open access for a university, and of course it provides a lot of institutional management information. As this rector said, he once was asked, this is the rector of the University of Liège, he was asked why he was so serious about open access, and he said, because I kept being asked how many articles my researchers published each year, and I had to say I have no idea. And he found that embarrassing. He said it's rather like running a factory and people saying, what do you make? And I have to say, I'm sorry, I don't know what we make, but it seems to be going fine. So he asked the library to build the repository, he put his policy in place, and he's worked very hard ever since to make that policy a success. So let's have a look at the outreach to the public that this kind of attitude, this kind of championing from a university manager can effect. Who are the public? Well, first of all, there's independent researchers. So these are people not based in a university like me, for example, with no access to a university library. Actually, I can walk into Exeter University Library still for nothing, and they must be one of the few that allows this now, which is very welcome. But when I'm in there, I can only look at things in hard copy. I cannot get onto the library intranet to look at anything electronic. So it rather is not very useful for me. So there's a lot of it, but there's a lot of independent researchers out there without access to an institutional library. There's the education sector, the high school sector, where teachers are looking, in many cases, for research-based information that they can use in their teaching. There's the professional community, like your general practitioner or your dentist or your legal practice. none of those have access to university libraries. There is the practitioner community, like civil engineers, for example, or architects, who need to see basic research, in many cases because they're going to innovate on top of that. And yet they can't do that without paying a pay-per-view fee to get to a paper. There's the interested, what we call lay public. That sounds a bit pejorative. There's the interested public, many of whom are engaged now in things like citizen science initiatives. Don't ignore them. There are many people out there interested in your work. And then, of course, there's the business sector, including the innovative small and medium-sized enterprises, which is a very important part of our economy and absolutely has to have access to the research information and doesn't in most cases, certainly not the smaller companies. MIT publishes every year this map which shows the usage of material from its repository. The red is the areas of the greater usage, goes through orange, green to yellow. So you can see that it's getting, the material in there is getting usage wherever research is done to any degree in the world. So that's great. It's getting a good outreach, and these are people, if I may make the point again, that do not have access to the journals it's published in. If they did, they will be looking in the journals and not in the repository. So this is the new audience that MIT is reaching with this repository. I think the most interesting thing about this graph is that the US is giving a very high level of usage there. And that shows, probably shows that many US universities don't have particularly well-endowed libraries and are struggling to buy the journals that they need. But it also almost certainly means that the US small business sector is in there, and the interested lay public, looking at things like health information and environmental information. PubMed Central, which is a very large repository, it has it's probably about 2.5 million now, full-text articles on biomedicine, run by the National Institutes of Health in the US. Huge. Gets over 500,000 individual users per day. Only a quarter of them are from universities. Only a quarter are from universities. Nearly 20% are from government and others. We don't know what the others are. They are unidentifiable. But lots of government users. 40% coming from private domain IP addresses. Nearly 20% from companies, people with company addresses. Why am I making this point about companies? Because I'm trying to talk to the institutional managers here now and the people from the research offices. This is a serious point about the reach of your institution out to the economically active part of our national economy. Every few years, probably every year, the European Commission carries out this exercise, Community Innovation Statistics, and each year it asks a different question. The year that this was published or done, it was about how innovative small companies find the information they need to innovate. Where do they go and where do they successfully find it? And the headline there tells you a lot. There's a weak link, concluded this study, between those enterprises and public research institutes and universities, which is a terrible thing because public research institutes and universities are meant to be feeding good quality research-based information into society so that these companies can develop products and services and benefit us all. If you look at the graph within that study, this is asking people, these companies, which they found the most useful source of information. And universities come down the bottom there. Only the research institutes are below it. So at the top there, they're going to their customers, their suppliers, their competitors, anywhere that they can find this information. But the universities are not successful in getting it out to these companies. Does it matter? Yes, it matters to the companies. This is our own study, which we did at the invitation of the Danish government, because they were concerned about the findings in that economic survey, concerned about small Danish companies that innovate and need information. Were they having trouble? Well, it was critically important to half of them, and 80% of them have difficulties accessing the basic research information they need to do their job. The delays and the time spent trying to find that information costs 70 million euros a year to researchers in Danish firms, and the Danish economy isn't very big. It's nothing like the UK's. So this is a significant amount of money. Multiplied up, extrapolated across the whole of the EU, of course, this comes to a huge amount. We asked them about the delay to their product to market time, the delay in that. And they said, and we worked out that the average delay, given that they couldn't access information easily, was about 2 years. And that, of course, has a cost to the company. It's around 5 million euros for each small company, that delay in getting their product to market. Now, the Danish government's very interested in this and is trying to do something about it. And one of the things they've done is put in a national policy on open access to try to help things along. We're back to QUT now, because I'm talking about the same point. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor of QUT uses these two graphs to illustrate one of the aspects of the success of his policy, or the benefit his policy has brought, he thinks, to QUT. The blue curve there shows the increase in research income over the few years in the middle of the last decade for all Australian universities averaged out, and the orange line shows QUT. So it was outperforming the average very well, and in fact it was outperforming almost all individual, well, it was all individual universities there. And to show you that in another way, you can see the percentage increase there, just shown in that form, outperforming the other universities in terms of bringing in research income. Now, what was that? We delved into that by asking the researchers who at that time were putting their work in the repository and making it open access, what effect that had had on them. And we got a lot of testimonies back, plus some very good examples. But here's one of them. Now, this is a lady who researches in design, so industrial design, and she had developed a methodology. Some Australian industry company had found that by Googling around on the web, found her methodology, got in contact with her. Next minute, they're funding her to do some research specifically for them. And this was by no means the only case. So the tie-up there, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor says, is that by beaming our research out to the world, we are pulling in research income, because suddenly these companies can find out what we're doing and who is doing it. So this was by no means the only one of these. There were lots of these testimonies. Very interesting ones too. So, no wonder the number of mandatory policies has been rising over the last decade, and that graph shows you the general picture. The funder policies at the bottom in red, the institutional policies in blue, and the sub-institutional, that's department or school level policies in green, rising nicely. Why do I keep saying that M word, mandatory? Because it matters. These 4 institutions have had a mandatory policy for some years now, and as I've said, in QUT, which is shown here as Queensland, has had theirs since 2004, and so has the University of Minho in Portugal. CERN has had a policy for a long time, and Southampton brought its own policy in a few years after the others. You can see the levels of open access that had accrued about 5 years ago, this graph. It hasn't been done again, but it's being done again right now. So again, that will be published this summer. This is the average for those 4, and this shows the average overall. So where you do not have a mandatory policy that is well supported by the institution, you're getting something like 15 or 20% of the outputs voluntarily made open access by the researchers, where you put a mandatory policy in place and support it properly, sensitively, helpfully, encouragingly, then you get much higher levels. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, Liège has now overtaken all of these because it has the best design policy and has reached 85%. So that is excellent. Some good news. This job ad appeared last week on the web. Head of Scholarly Communication. This is not an unusual thing to see advertised, but it tends to be mostly in American universities, but this is a British one. Head of Scholarly Communication, what is that? And that is a nice but interesting new title. Well, you can see there the university that put that ad up. It's Cambridge. That is highly significant, that Cambridge University has suddenly sat up and taken notice and is prepared to pay quite a nice amount, as you can see there, between £55,000 and £64,000 a year to somebody who is going to deliver joined up strategies, policies and mechanisms in support of the creation, transformation, dissemination and preservation of scholarly output. This is not just about open access, though that's part of it. This is a big job. It means, that description means that the university is taking very seriously, all of a sudden, that its scholars communicate, and it's going to look after what they do for all time. It's going to preserve it. It's going to help them in the creation and the publishing, the dissemination of that, and it's going to make it openly available. And as you can say, it's a senior role reporting directly to the university librarian. It's all about the university's strategic priorities in support of scholarly communication across the university. Fab. This is just what we wanted. But it gets better, because here he is, the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge. Look, believe me, Cambridge has taken no notice. Well, that's not fair. The library has taken a lot of notice of open access, but as a university that could really take others along with it, we have not, until recently, had the attention of the senior management. The library's done the very best it can and has made a good job of that. But now we have the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, and he's saying things like this. The first debate we have to have is where we're going with open access. And at the moment we are raising green open access as the direction going forward. So it's supporting, he's saying, our repository as our tool for making Cambridge's work open access. But then he adds something else there, which I encourage you to read while it's up there. If you think that genie is out of the bottle, just wait until we get into open data debates. I'm not going to talk about open data today because you won't be out of here before 5 o'clock. But I am just going to finish with this slide, which is about what's hot at the moment. So I start with open data and I move swiftly on to university level publishing. Lots of new initiatives suddenly from universities about whether they can do this themselves, whether they can make their press do it, whether in the case such as UCL, they have revitalized and rebuilt their university press as an open access publisher, whether they can use their repository as the publishing platform for journals from those institutions. There's a lot going on here, so watch out. The cost of scholarly communication is the other, I think, big issue at the moment. And in fact, in the last 2 weeks, there's been a real lot of discussion about this on the list. The cost of subscriptions and the fact that university libraries have to sign non-disclosure agreements with publishers so they can't tell each other what they're paying for the package from that publisher. So that needs looking at. Open access itself and the costs of that, whether an institution is going to pay for gold open access, whether the funders should pay, whether it's going to ignore gold open access in policy terms, and especially about the cost of hybrid gold open access. And if I may just explain that for those of you who don't know, this means that many subscription journals will take an individual paper if the author pays them some money and make that one paper openly available within an issue of otherwise closed off papers. We call that hybrid open access. It costs a lot of money in most cases, and there's suddenly a lot of interest in how much that is costing and why we should be paying publishers not only for the subscriptions, but as well to make individual articles open access, because you don't get your money back if you do that. And the debate is about creating what some people call a competitive market. I leave that with you to decide whether that's a possible thing or not in terms of scholarly communication. It's certainly desirable, but whether it's possible, I don't know. I leave you with this. I've given you a couple of Vice-Chancellor level, or 3 examples of Vice-Chancellors taking open access seriously. This man was the first president of Johns Hopkins University, so he's not still alive. This was more than 200 years ago, and he said this: "It's one of the noblest duties of a university to advance knowledge and to diffuse it, not merely among those who can attend the daily lectures, but far and wide." So Mr. Gilman, bless him, was, as far as I know, the first documented open access advocate. And he understood it all. He understood that it wasn't just about reaching people in academia. It was about outreach to the rest of society, because that's what a university's job is, to help raise the level of knowledge and understanding of all of us. So I leave you with that and say thank you very much for listening.